been most accepted has been the one that they started somewhere in the northern coast of South America and traveled northward through the island chain, starting right down in the south at Trinidad and spreading finally right up to Cuba in the north.
But from my understanding, the Caribs in St. Vincent and Grenadines was more numerous and more numbers here than a lot of the other islands. How did that happen?
Well, when we say the Caribs, we are thinking of one lot of persons, indigenous persons who inhabited the islands. What I said earlier on was that the people from the northern coast of South America traveled northward through the island chain. Well, those were not really the Caribs as such, but they were the indigenous persons who preceded the Caribs. The Caribs were perhaps the last of three different lots of people. The Siboneyes, followed by the Arawaks, and eventually by the Caribs. But they all migrated northward through the island chain, the Caribs, of course, being the last ones to do so. So there were three different waves of these indigenous people traveling northward through the island chain.
The black Veronica, the black Caribs, what is their ancestry? How did they get behave in St. Vincent?
The concept has always been that the black Caribs came into being because of the mixture between the yellow Caribs and persons from Africa. That is the general belief, that the two races got mixed together, out of which came the black Caribs.
So, from history, I read a lot about the struggles between the French, the Caribs, and the British, the Caribs. Why did the Caribs, the black Veronica, put up such a resistance against the British?
Well, that's a pretty far-reaching question. The point is, if we can think of the indigenous people inhabiting most of these islands in the Eastern Caribbean, that became home to them and remained undisturbed for quite some period of time. As you realize, once you have set up your own home, you would scarcely want to have anyone come and disturb you in your setting. Once they became very comfortable there, they viewed it not only as their home, but as their territory which they were forced to protect against all comers. They would welcome strangers, but if you felt that you were going to take over their homeland, they would guard it very, very jealously indeed. And that is why, of course, the early friction came not at the very, very outset of the mixture between the Caribs and the indigenous people, but as they went along, it would seem that the two lots of people produced the black Caribs, and suddenly you had an influx of people from Europe who not only wanted just to be there and live with the people who were there, but to take over the territory completely. And because of that, of course, there would have been some friction, and the Caribs decided, well, this is our homeland, and we would defend it against all comers.
But I understand the French people, they came here before the British, and like they settled and mingled more with the Caribs, and they wanted just not so much land as when the British came to plant sugar. They want vast estates, and so the French was different than the British in that way.
Well, if you look at the very first history we have of the French being there, it would seem that their first attempt was not so much to, well, I wouldn't say it wasn't to colonize, but they had a different slant to their colonization in that they were trying to spread religion, and the Christian religion at that, They were trying to spread the Christian religion among these people. Well, it was partly successful until there was an incident which upset the whole program. And once that had been upset, the French were very, very hostile to the Caribs. And because of that hostility, the relationship between the Caribs and the French broke down almost automatically. And for a long time, the French were not very welcome. It didn't mean, however, that they just disappeared completely, because they still continued to make inroads into what was there existing at that time. They started doing a little farming, and they befriended the Caribs. But the Caribs were always a little bit suspicious of them because of the incident which drove them apart.
But with the coming of the British, all that changed.
Well, with the coming of the British, you had a complete change, and it was almost a constitutional change, a political change. It wasn't only a case of people trying to live on the island. It was a case where once the British, after the Treaty of Paris, 1763, after that, they saw St. Vincent as their territory. Now, anybody who saw St. Vincent at that time as their own property had to come up against those who also felt that St. Vincent was their homeland, which they were quite prepared to defend to the very death. The English then, of course, had different ideas. They thought of colonizing the country, and of course, in colonizing, it wasn't only just a form of government, but it was sort of changing the face of the landscape, planting sugar, which was going to be an economic crop. And that is what the Caribs had to give up their land so that this dream of planting sugarcane on the island would be a reality. And that is what they fought against.
The first Carib War, I understand that, was from 1772 to 1773. What was the outcome of that?
Well, that was a very strange war. The English by then had set their sights on taking the whole island, and the Caribs had begun to resist. The English got the views of the planters, and the planters were beginning to say, well, the only way out was to get these people off the island. There was going to be no compromise, because they were not going to be friendly to the sovereign King of England, and they were not going to be friendly to the planters. Therefore, the only way out was to get them off the island. But that was sort of frowned upon by some people in England and quite a number of persons elsewhere. Therefore, they had virtually to do it in stages. Now, the English then sent in the forces were marshaled from England and came out and had a little battle here with the Caribs. But the Caribs, of course, were the ones who virtually introduced this guerrilla warfare. And the English played more or less into their hands, in that when the war began, it was late in the year, when it was wet, it was rainy, the trees in the forest were sort of, in full bloom. Therefore, they could come out in the day or in the night, attack the English forces and retreat to the forests during the night. And instead of the English making a lot of headway, they started losing very heavily. As a matter of fact, one of the stories is that they actually lost that war, but the command came from England to break off at that point and sort of make some sort of relationship with the Caribs so that they could continue to foster their own hopes of achieving the island more peacefully.
But at the end of that war, they signed a treaty and give the Caribs a certain portion of the land, like from Byra right up to like Fancy, that place, Grand Sable, go right up to Rabrico. That part of the land was preserved, like who they call like the black Caribs. The difference between the black and the yellow and the yellow Caribs was in a settlement on a different side of the island?
Well, that's not as simple as you made it sound there. The division started very, very much earlier, but by the time we got to that post-1772-73 war, there was a division of land, and the Caribs were not satisfied with the division of the land. As you realize, if you thought that the whole territory was yours and you were sidelined and put to a part of it, naturally you would respond by almost aggressively holding on to what is yours. So that what triggered the Second World War, Second Carib War, sorry, what triggered the Second Carib War was the fact that in spite of what was given to the Caribs, the English continued to encroach on the land, to destroy the crops of the Caribs, and you know, slowly to take over what was not allocated to them in the first place.
But in the Second Carib War, the yellow Caribs and the black Caribs, did they fought together against the British, or it was just the black Caribs who did most of the fighting? How did
The story is that a large number of the yellow Caribs did not fight against the British. Now, when we say a large number, of course, we're speaking about small numbers. In today's world, you think of millions. We're talking about hundreds or perhaps a few thousand. But the Carib community then was already divided because the yellow Caribs had found that they were virtually dispossessed of their lands by the black Caribs. That is how part of the history goes anyway, that the yellow Caribs fought against the black Caribs. Therefore, you could see if there was a third party making a bid for the island, that the yellow Caribs perhaps would stay on one side and the black Caribs on the other side. The people, however, who carried the main part of the struggle, they were the black Caribs. And there were some yellow Caribs who joined the struggle as well. But they were also helped by the French, so that there was a mixture of French, black Caribs, and some yellow Caribs.
So, the result of the Second Carib War, right? They say after the Second Carib War, the British took out some 5,000 black Caribs to Baliso, and the black Caribs who didn't surrender, some went up in Greg's Valley and some went to Maroon. How will you see that?
Well, that is how the history is set down. As you realize, we have depended on the English sources mainly for our information. We are now in the process of trying to get the French interpretation of what happened at that point in time. And so we might, at a later date, have a different conclusion. But that is how it worked out, that the black Caribs were forced to surrender. Now, as you realize, they had the pressure against them of not only the local militia, but also the soldiers from the region, as well as help from outside the region, so that they were greatly outnumbered. And of course, the Caribs, although they had some support from the French, they didn't have the access to the weapons that the people who were invading had. Therefore, although they resisted as best they could, they in the end were subdued. Now, the story goes that those who surrendered, 5,026 is one of the figures given. There's a slightly smaller figure as well, 4,338. Of those who surrendered, they were brought to Calicut and then sent on to the island of Baliso. Those persons who have been working on the archaeology of Baliso have contended rather earnestly that they didn't think that Baliso could support 5,026 people. But that is the number that was given as those who surrendered and who were shipped out to Baliso.
So, what happened to the Carib language and the Carib culture after they left St. Vincent?
Well, you've jumped the gun a little bit there because you're taking it now from the end of the war to the where we are today. That's taking a big chunk out of what happened there, because from Baliso, as you realize, we are told that quite a few of the people fell ill and many died on Baliso. In other words, nearly half of those who were imprisoned on Baliso in the 8 months on which they were on Baliso died. One of the English doctors who, I better say one of the doctors, I'm not sure if he was English or what, but one of the doctors who attended the people on Baliso said that they died because of overeating. They said that when the soldiers were fighting, they didn't have enough to eat and so on. And when they got onto Baliso, there was so much food there for them that they ate too much and they died from overeating. Well, it takes a lot of believing to believe something like that. But more than half of them died in the 8 months period and died in captivity. They were prisoners of war. And that is one of the things which still haunts people around the world. If a prisoner of war dies when he is a prisoner of war, you virtually have to explain that, especially in these days, you have to explain it. But there was no need for explanation then. The truth is that those who survived were put on ships and taken across to Central America. What happened to the others? Now, it wasn't everybody who was living on Baliso at the time who left Baliso. Some were too ill, and some, they were certain they couldn't make the journey. Therefore, they were left to die on Baliso, or I don't know how those came to an end, but anyway, some were left on Baliso. Everybody who was on Baliso did not leave with that group that went to Central America. Now, what happened to those who were on the mainland? Those who had resisted, we are told that some ran back into, and mainly the Black Caribs we're talking about, they resisted and they retreated into the Massareca Valley, up into Greg's and up there. And that is perhaps where you would mainly find some of the true descendants of the All Blacks Caribs, if I would put it that way. Now, what happened to the others? There were some, as I said earlier on, who did not take part in the struggle, the Yellow Caribs. Unfortunately for them, at the end of the resistance, it would appear that the English felt that they could not be trusted anyway. And so they pushed them very far up north, to the extreme north of the island, and sort of took them out of harm's way, perhaps. They would not give any more problems. And also, some were sent back to the Maine, that's the northern coast of South America. So we have a movement of people, those who remained, those who went into the hills, into hiding, those who were pushed up to the northern part of the island, right below the Soufriere volcano, because I'm sure that it was hoped that by putting them up there, that they would eventually be exterminated anyway. The volcano had to just erupt once more, twice more, and that would be the end of them. And some of the others were then sent onto the northern coast of South America, the Maine.
And what about Maroon? I understand that some went to Greg's and some went to Maroon, above the Lacari River and Waterloo River, up in that region.
Well, as you realize, what happened, those who were put up there were put in an enclave, more or less. Well, they were given a piece of land. They were not supposed to sell it. They were not encouraged any strangers among them. They were allowed to plant crops, anything they wanted to plant except sugarcane. But there were two little settlements that they had originally. The names are I'm a little bit adrift on the names right now. But eventually they moved from the northeastern part of the island, around the top of the island and onto Duvalier on the other side, on the western side. But they were given there were two settlements in the first instance. I can't remember the names right now, but that was where they first started. And then they spread, of course, all around in the northern tip, because that was the area then virtually which was reserved for them.
So, but today, the traces of the Caribbean culture, the Carib culture and language. And when I go around the country and you asking the people around the history, so I find that hardly anybody of Caribbean century today really know the history. How is that?
Well, it's the easiest thing to explain. If you are a people who have been taken prisoners, if half of those who are fighting died, the other half was sent to Central America, and only a few of the yellow Caribs remained, and a few of the black Caribs who had escaped into the forests, it is obvious that after a little while, the language would slowly disappear, and whatever little there was of the culture would also disappear, because now you have the whole of the island virtually being taken over by the English and subsequently those persons who joined them after the Caribs were sent into exile. So that you would scarcely expect that they would flourish as a people. If there was ever going to be a hope that any part of that would flourish as a people, it would be those who were exiled, because that would more or less bond them together so that they could communicate with each other. But here you had on the island still a few French people, not very many. The French had virtually disappeared by then, and the English taking over. Well, we know by what we have seen in the history later on, the English did not allow, even when the Africans arrived here, anything from Africa to be sort of be perpetuated here. The customs and the cultures and the language were all wiped from the slate. Therefore, the few Caribs who remained here, who would certainly, they virtually had no voice. And having no voice, of course, they would certainly, as they died out, whatever they knew of their own existence would virtually disappear with them.
I noticed though, watching videos from Belize and so, with the cassava, the way they make it, I see the similarity here still with how they make the cassava and do the cassava bread. Understand when the Caribs left, they took some plants or something with them.
Well, when they were put off the island, they were given some seeds, and they were given some plants, and they were given one or two other little bits and pieces. But when they took them to Roatan, the situation in Roatan was described as being such that it was a place where even the iguanas would find it difficult to exist. So that it was going to be a very difficult time for them. They could carry memories of the country where they lived, but they had to start a life anew. As a matter of fact, the Spanish had occupied that Roatan Island, and the British took it back from the Spanish and just put the Caribs on there and said, get on with it, you have a new life, and see how you go from there. It was up to the black Caribs then, after to try their best to exist on the conditions which they found there at that time.
I understand the Garifuna people from Central America have a high regard for this man, St. Vincent Don't you think we should try to introduce some history and culture to bring people on, to bring back the language and the culture and the things that we do to this ancient people here? Because it's so rich.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that. Over the years, the people who now live on St. Vincent knew very little of those who were exiled. It is only within rather recent times that those who were exiled virtually have made the effort to reconnect with the people on mainland St. Vincent, that anybody has sort of been able to revive anything of the fact that they were once one people. Those people who were over there, they always knew that they came from here. But the English had then completely removed from the memory of the people over here who the people were that they exiled, so that it was simpler for them to keep what they had than for those who remained on the island here to preserve what they had.
But people like you and Dr. Fraser and Dr. Kirby been doing a lot of work, writing books, like you now write a lot of books and so. What are you really doing most of all besides the books that could try to help to bring those books in school to teaching children history, culture?
Well, it is an ongoing movement. As we realized, when we were children growing up, we knew virtually nothing of those who went into exile. The word Garifuna is virtually completely new to us. And if you went around St. Vincent and asked how many people know anything of Black Caribs and so on, a few years ago, everybody would have said that we know nothing about them. Today, of course, there's a little bit more knowledge that these people are the same persons who were exiled from St. Vincent and still have an existence and have multiplied into perhaps thousands upon thousands, spreading up and down the area of Central America and into North America. So that there is more knowledge now, and once the impetus is set, we can see perhaps in the future that more will develop, and those over there would know more of us, and certainly those of us over here would know a little bit more about them. Well, if you put the two together, somewhere along the line, they would reconnect, and we should make some progress in the same area that you're referring to.
By putting the history books in school that is now coming out to you from the primary up to secondary.
Well, I don't know who we should blame for it or praise for it, but at one time we did a little bit of the history of St. Vincent as written by Ebenezer Duncan in the primary schools, but and in the junior secondary schools. But for some reason, I think that was the teaching of history per se. I wouldn't say it was abandoned, but it wasn't given the pride of place that it should have been given. And now I think we're going back over that little area again to try and see if we could correct that, so that the children who are going through the school system now have an opportunity to learn a little bit more about St. Vincent, the history of St. Vincent. And if you're doing the history of St. Vincent, you cannot exclude the history of the indigenous people, and as such, by extension, you cannot exclude the history of the Caribs.
And I think the culture and the history is ongoing, not just during Heritage Month, and so it should be like an everyday occurrence.
Well, that should be in the area of those persons who walk the corridors of power and who decide what we learn and what we won't learn. Fortunately, however, with the exposure now to television and that sort of thing, you can learn about your own country, not living in your country itself, but living overseas, so that the knowledge is widespread, and happily and possibly a good thing for us, is that it's now being put on the screens all around, and you learn a little bit more, whether you like it or not, or if you appreciate it or not. It's there for those who would want to access the information.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. The information that you've given today is very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah,
Can we do a little bit more? Would that be all right?
Sorry?